The moment before the fall is never loud. It rarely announces itself, and it almost never feels like danger. It feels ordinary. It feels justified. It feels like everything is still working. My name is Edmund Hale. I have spent years observing the decisions that precede collapse, not the collapse itself, but the quiet moments that make it inevitable. There was one man in particular who understood this moment better than most. He did not possess secret information. He did not control the market. He simply observed what others ignored. His name was Jesse Livermore. Long before his name became legend, he was just another participant in a crowded room filled with certainty. Men spoke confidently about continuation. Prices had risen steadily, and familiarity had replaced caution. Nothing in the room suggested instability. Nothing appeared broken. And yet Livermore had already begun to see something others could not. It was not a headline. It was not an event. It was a subtle shift in behavior, a hesitation where there had once been conviction, a movement without commitment, the kind of change that reveals itself only to those who are willing to question what appears obvious. He did not react immediately. He waited, because he understood something most never learn. The market does not collapse when fear is present. It collapses when confidence remains intact. In those years, the market had developed a rhythm that felt dependable. Advances were followed by pauses, and pauses were followed by advances. Each interruption appeared temporary. Each recovery reinforced the same conclusion. The upward movement was not only intact, it was expected. Participants no longer questioned continuation. They anticipated it. Livermore had learned early that markets did not move because of logic. They moved because of behavior. And behavior, when repeated long enough, begins to create belief. Belief turns observation into assumption. Assumption turns caution into participation. He spent long hours doing very little. This confused those around him. Activity was seen as competence. Action was mistaken for understanding. But Livermore was not interested in appearing correct. He was interested in recognizing when others were no longer capable of seeing clearly. He watched how prices moved when new highs were reached. He watched how quickly advances were sustained, and more importantly, how they failed to sustain themselves. There were moments when price continued upward, but without urgency. Moments when movement existed, but conviction did not. The difference was subtle, and it was easy to ignore. Most participants focused on direction. Livermore focused on character. He understood that strength was not defined by movement alone. Strength revealed itself through continuation. When strength was real, it persisted without effort. When it was artificial, it required constant reinforcement. What he began to notice was not collapse, but hesitation. The market was still rising, but it was doing so differently. Advances required more time. Reactions appeared faster. Recoveries lacked the same authority they once possessed. Nothing had failed, and yet nothing felt as certain as before. The room itself remained unchanged. Conversations sounded the same. Confidence remained visible. Those who had been correct continued to feel correct. There was no external signal demanding reassessment. And that was precisely the condition Livermore had learned to recognize. The most dangerous moment is not when everyone is afraid. It is when no one sees a reason to be. Livermore understood that recognition alone was not enough. Many participants sense discomfort at some point, but sensing discomfort and acting on it are entirely different decisions. The difficulty was not identifying the change. The difficulty was trusting it before it became obvious. He had seen this pattern before. Markets rarely reverse in a moment of chaos. They reverse in moments of agreement. When most participants reach the same conclusion, when continuation becomes the default expectation, the conditions for interruption are already in place. He continued to observe without announcing his conclusions. There was no advantage in convincing others. In fact, agreement would have been a warning sign. He preferred isolation. Isolation meant his observations were not yet reflected in collective behavior. He noticed how reactions were handled. In the past, temporary declines had been met with immediate recovery. Buyers would return quickly, restoring confidence before doubt had time to develop. But now recovery required more effort. Time itself had begun to behave differently. The market was still functioning, but its responses had lost their precision. He paid attention to what did not happen. The absence of continuation mattered more than continuation itself. When strength is authentic, it reveals itself naturally. When strength must be defended, its absence is already present. This is where most participants fail. They search for confirmation in visible events. They wait for certainty to justify action. But certainty does not exist at the beginning of change. It exists at the end. Livermore understood that the opportunity was not in reacting to collapse. The opportunity was in recognizing when collapse had already become possible. There was no announcement, no signal that demanded attention, only a gradual separation between appearance and reality. To everyone else, the market still appeared intact. To Livermore, it no longer behaved that way. The decision itself did not happen in a moment of urgency. It happened gradually, as observation replaced doubt. Livermore had learned that the greatest risk was not being wrong. The greatest risk was acting without clarity. And clarity, when it arrived, was rarely dramatic. It was quiet. It did not demand action. It allowed it. He did not move immediately. Patience was not hesitation. Patience was confirmation. He understood that acting too early and acting too late produced the same result. Both were reactions to emotion, not behavior. He waited for the market to reveal itself further, not through what it said, but through what it failed to do. Each day, the same pattern continued. Movement without follow-through, advances without authority, confidence without reinforcement. To most participants, these were meaningless variations. To Livermore, they were consistency. Consistency not of strength, but of weakening. He began to act in small ways at first, not as a declaration, but as alignment. His decisions were not driven by prediction. They were driven by recognition. He was not attempting to force an outcome. He was positioning himself for the outcome that behavior had already made possible. This was the part no one else could see. From the outside, nothing had changed. The room still sounded confident. Prices had not collapsed. There was no visible failure. And yet, Livermore was no longer participating in the same reality as everyone else. He understood something most never accept. The market does not punish ignorance immediately. It allows belief to continue. It allows comfort to remain. It allows participants to feel correct long enough to commit fully. That is when reversal becomes unavoidable. By the time the first undeniable signs appeared, Livermore was no longer reacting. He had already decided. The collapse, when it finally arrived, was not a surprise to him. It was a confirmation. When the change finally became visible, it did not arrive as a single event. It arrived as interruption. What had once continued effortlessly now required explanation. Movements that had once been dismissed as temporary began to persist. Confidence, which had filled the room without effort, began to require justification. At first, no one called it collapse. They called it reaction. They called it correction. They called it opportunity. Familiar language was used to preserve familiar belief. Participants searched for reasons to maintain the conclusion they had already accepted. They did not question the assumption itself. They questioned only the interruption. Livermore had seen this sequence before. He knew that recognition spread slowly. The mind does not abandon certainty easily. It protects it. It explains away contradiction. It waits for restoration. But restoration did not arrive. Each attempt to recover lacked the same authority it once possessed. Each effort to resume continuation failed to produce continuation. What had once required no defense now required constant defense. And defense, when it becomes necessary, reveals what has already been lost. The room began to change. Conversations became quieter, not silent but uncertain. The confidence that had once filled every decision was no longer automatic. Participants who had acted without hesitation began to hesitate. They searched for confirmation that did not exist. This was the moment Livermore understood would come, not because he predicted it, but because he recognized the conditions that made it inevitable. Collapse is not a moment. Collapse is a process. By the time it becomes visible, it has already been in motion. He did not feel relief. He did not feel triumph. He felt recognition. The outcome had not been created in that moment. It had been created in the moments before it. In the days that followed, explanations began to appear. Participants searched for causes they could understand. They pointed to events. They pointed to news. They pointed to reasons that had only become visible after the outcome was already in motion. This is how the mind protects itself. It assigns meaning after consequence, so it does not have to confront the decisions made before it. But Livermore knew the truth was simpler and more difficult to accept. The collapse had not been caused by a single event. It had been caused by behavior. Behavior that had repeated itself until belief replaced observation. Belief that had persisted even as conditions began to change. He had not acted because he was certain of the future. He had acted because he recognized the present. He understood that the market reveals itself through subtlety long before it reveals itself through consequence. Those who wait for confirmation wait for visibility, and visibility arrives too late to be useful. He did not consider himself immune to error. He did not consider himself superior to those around him. He simply understood that confidence is not evidence. Confidence is often the result of repetition, not accuracy. When something continues long enough, it creates the illusion of permanence. This illusion is what traps most participants. They do not see what is changing because they are focused on what has not yet changed. They measure reality against expectation instead of measuring expectation against reality. Livermore had trained himself to do the opposite. He did not ask whether the market could continue. He asked whether the behavior that sustained continuation was still present. When that behavior disappeared, continuation became impossible, even if price had not yet reflected it. This is the difference between reacting and recognizing. By the time others began to understand what was happening, Livermore had already accepted it. He had understood the moment before the fall. I have often returned to this moment not because of what it produced, but because of what it revealed. Jesse Livermore did not succeed because he knew something others did not. He succeeded because he was willing to see what others refused to see. He did not wait for the market to announce its change. He observed the behavior that made change inevitable. Most participants believe the critical moment is the collapse itself. They remember the speed, the confusion, the consequence, but the collapse is only the final expression of decisions made long before it begins. By the time it becomes visible, the opportunity to understand it has already passed. The true moment exists earlier. It exists in the quiet separation between appearance and reality. It exists when confidence remains, but certainty is no longer supported by behavior. It exists when continuation is assumed, but no longer sustained. This moment does not create urgency, it creates comfort. That's why it is so easily ignored. Livermore understood that the market does not deceive participants. Participants deceive themselves. They project permanence onto conditions that are temporary. They interpret repetition as stability. They mistake familiarity for safety. And when the outcome finally contradicts their belief, they experience surprise. But surprise is not created by the market. It is created by expectation. This is what Livermore had learned. Not how to predict collapse, but how to recognize when belief had moved further than reality could support. He did not act because he was certain of what would happen. He acted because he was no longer convinced by what appeared to be happening. The moment before the fall does not ask for attention, it offers observation. And only those who are willing to observe without assumption are able to see it. There is a misconception that experience protects participants from error, that those who have seen enough will not repeat the same mistakes. But experience alone does not create awareness. Experience creates familiarity, and familiarity, if left unexamined, creates confidence. Confidence simplifies decision-making. It removes hesitation. It allows action to feel natural. This is why it is so dangerous. The moment decision-making feels easiest is often the moment observation has stopped. Livermore understood that clarity does not come from certainty. It comes from distance. Distance from the need to be right. Distance from the comfort of agreement. distance from the reassurance of repetition. He had learned to observe without attachment, to see behavior without interpreting it through expectation. This is what allowed him to recognize the shift while others continued to participate as if nothing had changed. Most participants do not fail because they lack intelligence. They fail because they trust familiarity more than observation. They continue to act within a reality that no longer exists because it is the reality they have come to expect. By the time they recognize the difference, recognition has lost its value. Livermore did not wait for permission to understand what he was seeing. He did not require confirmation from others. He accepted the isolation that comes with independent observation. This is the cost of clarity. It separates the individual from the collective at the exact moment the collective feels most certain. And it is in this separation that the moment before the fall becomes visible. What happened to Jesse Livermore was not unique to his time. The instruments have changed. The speed has increased. Information moves faster than ever before. And yet, the moment before the fall remains exactly the same. It does not depend on technology. It does not depend on access. It depends on behavior. Participants continue to search for certainty in environments defined by uncertainty. They continue to find comfort in continuation. They continue to trust what has been working long after the conditions that made it work have begun to disappear. This is why the moment remains invisible to most. It does not appear as danger. It appears as stability. It appears as normal. Livermore understood that markets do not collapse because participants are unprepared. They collapse because participants believe preparation is no longer necessary. They stop observing. They stop questioning. They stop recognizing the difference between what is happening and what they expect to happen. The fall itself is only the final confirmation of a process that began much earlier. A process defined by belief, reinforced by repetition, and protected by confidence. This is why the moment before the fall will always exist, because belief will always exist. And belief, when left unexamined, will always move further than reality can sustain. My name is Edmund Hale. I do not record the collapse. I record the moment before it becomes visible.